July 3rd, 2021, Lincoln, Nebraska. A July 4th party ends in terror.
An annual 3rd of July party that would soon descend into chaos.
Happened in a split second. We couldn't even see.
The day begins simply enough, an annual cookout for close friends and family. 21-year-old Amelia Graham invites everyone to her home and pays for it all.
Amelia, she's very down to earth and loving, a caring and generous person.
It's my favorite holiday. We always have a barbecue.
It was a full-on party, at least 100 people. The atmosphere was super fun.
Traditionally, the annual party ends with a fireworks show in the street, where everyone takes turns putting on a show.
All my friends bring their own. Personally, I do like just lighting them off myself because it's like, oh, I lit that one off, you guys.
A lot of the kids obviously couldn't wait their turn, so, moms or dads would walk their kids out to the street and, light the firework with them.
Still, everyone is aware of the potential danger.
There's a lot of trees around here. That's a fire hazard. So we do light them off in the streets.
And although setting off fireworks in an active street is technically illegal in Nebraska, it's not unusual to see during the holiday.
We have never had any issues with any vehicle. Sometimes they honk.
A lot of the cars who were going through the block were waiting for the fireworks to be done and then driving.
Before Amelia begins her fireworks show, a friend lights something known as a fountain.
It's like an overgrown sparkler. It's a shower of sparks and bright light.
It's almost blinding, and when it goes off, something horrifying happens.
I was in the middle of the driveway, and I just see a flash of light come out of my right eye.
It's so shocking, it takes a moment to realize that a car has slammed into someone. And it's Amelia.
I turned my eyes for a split second, and I just saw a body flying up into the air. She was standing in the middle of the street, and her body ends up on the curbside. I instantly called 911.
911 operator.
Amelia is severely injured.
She was bleeding from the head, the nose. I was terrified. It was gushing out of her mouth onto the street. I was scared.
Adonya's friends and family are in a complete panic.
My sister is literally pulling her hair out. And Amelia's mom was screaming. She was crying.
Whoever did this to Amelia, they didn't even slow down to see what happened.
We all were yelling, why would someone do this? Why didn't they even stop after they hit her? The car went through the four-way stop, blowing through about 40 miles per hour.
Was this a horrible accident, or was Amelia targeted on purpose?
You would hope that it was not the intent of the driver to strike the pedestrian. They did. Some kind of deliberate act.
I was so in shock. It could have been anyone.
It all happened so quickly, nobody sees the driver or the license plate.
It was a black Chevy Impala. We didn't know who it was.
And Amelia is in bad shape.
She was unconscious. I was trying to talk to her.
With an ambulance racing to the scene, Adonya tries to stay calm as she relays information to 911.
I just felt, completely sick to my stomach. My heart was racing, my hands were sweating. They asked me if she was still conscious and still breathing.
Everyone is terrified Amelia won't make it. But then she opens her eyes.
I was just kind of laying there. I was trying to get up. I couldn't get up.
She got a concussion from slamming onto the concrete. She skid across the street.
Amelia is rushed to the hospital.
I had to have surgery on my collarbone, and they had to put a plate in it. I did have really bad road rash all over my body. My hands were all scabbed and stuff. It was fairly bad. I did not recognize myself. My face means a lot to me. And then for it to just get completely destroyed, I was scared of myself, actually.
But she's lucky it isn't worse.
She could have been paralyzed, brain dead, or even dead.
Who ran her down? And why were they in such a hurry to get away?
I was just lighting a firework. I did see the car approaching, I put my hands up, like, stop. It was pretty terrifying. I was hit in the front and then I kind of just rolled. I just got knocked out.
At the scene, police interview eyewitnesses and gather physical evidence.
The suspect vehicle struck a parked car, leaving a transfer of black paint. The suspect's vehicle mirror broke off. Collecting that mirror, preserving that paint, could be crucial.
Still, police tell Amelia and her family that they don't have much to go on.
There was a lot of anger in my house. Everyone was just kind of upset.
So friends and family take matters into their own hands, knocking on neighbors' doors to find out if anyone has video from that night.
The neighbors across the street had a doorbell with a camera.
Then they release that video to the media in hopes of catching whoever is behind the wheel.
Tonight, a 21-year-old Lincoln woman is left with unanswered questions and severe injuries.
Unbelievable video of a hit and run and the victim talking to Channel 8.
I wouldn't wish this on anybody, at all.
The footage sparks immediate outrage.
They want that driver to come forward.
And just 2 days after the video goes viral, 22-year-old Isabel Knapp Cuevas tells police that she may have been involved, but claims she thought she hit a firework, not a person. Amelia's family is furious.
Anyone in their right mind would know that that kind of impact would have not been a firework.
None of us are buying it. When you hit a rock, you see it hit your windshield. If you hit a person, it would be hard to not see it. I did hit her windshield.
Big difference between hitting a firework and hitting a human being.
Police match the paint residue in the broken side mirror found at the scene to the black Chevy Impala that Isabel drives. They also discover something else. Her license is revoked for a past DUI.
While you're on the suspended list, your driving privileges are suspended and you're not allowed to be driving the vehicle.
And that explains why she fled in a panic.
The entire thing is exacerbated if there is personal injury involved while you're operating a vehicle while you're revoked.
Isabel is charged with leaving the scene of an injury accident, property damage, no vehicle registration, a stop sign violation, and driving while her license was revoked.
I do not believe she would have turned herself in if there wasn't anything posted on social media.
She knew that she was just going to get caught based on how many people were sharing and commenting on the video.
Not all of the reaction to the video is positive.
Why were you in the street? You saw that there were cars coming. You shouldn't be lighting fireworks off.
But the majority of the comments have been sympathetic.
You're lucky to be alive. We're very thankful God was there watching over you. You're going to be okay. It meant a lot to me knowing that there's still a lot of good people out there like that.
Amelia still isn't fully healed and suffers from memory loss.
Her recovery was super tough. She couldn't do basic things. She always needed assistance for everything.
It's a process to put myself back together. I think overall I'm doing a pretty good job at it. But for me, I want to move past it as fast as possible.
Moving past it includes not harboring anger towards the woman who caused her pain.
I don't really have any hate towards her or anything like that. I just kind of would want to know why she didn't stop or even try to slow down or why she didn't see if I was okay.
The one thing that does make Amelia sad is that for her, the 4th of July will never be the same.
It just sucks. I will never be able to enjoy it again. I don't believe I will ever light a firework, actually.
But she knows that's a small price to pay.
The lessons I've learned, never to stand in the street again. I look at it as, I have another chance. I'm not gonna let it stop me.
In Florida, another disturbing crime takes a dark turn that no one saw coming. December 6th, 2018, Okeechobee, Florida. It's about 8 p.m. A craving for fast food takes a horrifying turn for a grandmother out on the town.
A robbery that happened in a flash was all caught on camera.
Tonight, the thief is still on the run.
I had no idea that anybody would even do something like that. I guess it shocked me.
That night, after decorating their church with Christmas decorations, 76-year-old Janice Allen treats her friend, Miss Willie, to a fast food meal.
So these are obviously good ladies, good Samaritans out doing good deeds in their community.
Miss Willie and I are pals. We go everywhere together. And we sit next to the door at the back.
What they don't realize is there's a mysterious man in the parking lot outside. He is watching Miss Willie and Janice through the restaurant window, and then comes inside.
All of a sudden, we see a tall, slender, white-haired man enter from the bottom of the screen.
Janice had her back to the man.
He came out of nowhere. Miss Willie was reaching for a nugget, I think, and she just looked up and said, "He's got your purse."
At first, the women don't quite grasp what's happening.
Their belief is suspended. They don't want to believe that they either were about to be or in fact became victims of a crime.
It happened so quickly, they didn't even have time to react.
But it only takes a few moments to realize they've just been robbed, and Janice isn't having it.
And it was just like, wow. I just jumped up and went after him.
He bolts for the door. And I'm very impressed with her instinct. She takes off running after this man out the door. She's got this like long flowing cloak, kind of feeling like Little Red Riding Hood vibe.
He was very swift. I mean, he had long legs, and I've got very short legs.
Janice is in hot pursuit as the suspect dashes to his getaway car.
I was behind him. He went right to the car, maybe 6-7 feet, not very far.
She sees the man get in a silver SUV. She doesn't stop and scream for help. She doesn't yell at him. She doesn't pound on the hood of the car. Oh no, she actually reaches for the driver's side door.
He opened the door and he started to close it. Well, I grabbed the handle.
Her reaction was to open the door and basically physically go inside the car, reach inside the car to recover her purse.
For a 76-year-old woman, this is a bold move.
I did not see his face. All I can remember is he flipped the purse. There must have been somebody else in the car.
The panicked suspect throws the purse to a woman who is sitting in the passenger seat.
This guy's thinking he's gonna make a clean getaway, but he must have been completely dumbfounded when he looks over and sees this woman coming after her purse.
Then the thief hits the gas. And that's when something terrible happens.
He started to back up, and I was still holding onto the door, and it flung me under. My head is what hit that cement.
It's a terrifying moment. Janice is dragged across the pavement of this parking lot. It's a very tough thing to watch. You can definitely tell she's very, very close to the tires of this fast-moving car, and you can actually see her shoe fall off at the end where the car runs over her foot.
He ran over my elbow and my ankle on the right side.
Janice is knocked unconscious, and for a moment, her attacker hesitates.
He has a clear line of sight to see this woman laid out on the pavement, obviously in pain. You can still see the passenger of this car and the driver, the interior lights are on. They're not reacting. He hesitates for just maybe a split second, but then after that, he's out of there, lickety-split. Zero compassion.
Shocked bystanders and Janice's friend, Miss Willie, all run to her side. One woman frantically dials for help. This is serious. Janice is slipping in and out of consciousness, and the trauma to her head is severe.
I can remember Miss Willie saying, "Don't move her, don't move her." I don't remember anything else.
Who would do this, and why?
We're talking about little old ladies. They're in their 70s. They've just finished volunteering at their church, and this guy, this scumbag, chooses them.
In the hospital, doctors keep Janice under close observation due to swelling on the brain.
It's your brain, and it has no place to go. And it's very, very painful.
Everyone is baffled by the callous crime.
Now, of all the people this guy could have targeted this day, this may be the most cruel.
But police have little to go on.
They don't really have a clear image of the suspect. They don't have a clear license plate. All of those things creates a very difficult task for law enforcement in locating and apprehending the suspect.
Whoever the suspect is, he is in serious trouble.
Not only when the vehicle strikes Janice does it go from theft to robbery, but now a whole new offense is created, and that is a hit and run.
And all of it was for a shockingly small reward.
Only $4 in cash in the purse. Keys, credit cards, identification, all of that, all except the $4, was left in a parking lot nearby.
The one thing police do know is that this man seems to be a serial purse robber.
As it turns out, this was not this guy's first attempt. There were 2 other victims that he attempted to rob earlier the day, but he was never apprehended.
In an attempt to generate leads, police released the video to the media, and the story goes viral overnight.
Breaking news now, an elderly woman in the hospital tonight after she was nearly run over by a car.
'Tis a season for crimes of opportunity.
The grandmother was eating a Happy Meal when her handbag was stolen.
I was raised to always respect my elders. So watching something like this for me is deeply disturbing. This is not only disrespecting someone in the older generation, this is actually a violent assault against one of them caught on camera.
After 3 days, Janice is released from the hospital. There's a lingering threat of a dangerous blood clot developing near her brain, but her elbow and ankle, which the thief ran over, didn't break.
And they were all black and blue for a long, long time. Very badly bruised.
But not long after she gets home, there's some good news. The suspect has turned himself in.
All new this morning, this mugshot just into our newsroom of the man who deputies say took a woman's purse and then nearly ran her over.
This purse snatcher's sister sees the videos floating around Facebook. She knows it's him, and she convinces him to turn himself in.
His humanity, for whatever reason, surfaces.
I think he was afraid. He was fearful of what would happen if he did not turn himself in and he got caught.
Authorities charge 50-year-old Charles Alton Stratton Jr. with aggravated battery, robbery, and grand theft. His excuse for the violent attack?
According to police, Stratton told them that he was, quote, jonesing for some crack cocaine. That's why he stole the purse.
He was on drugs, and he wanted money for drugs.
On social media, there's intense outrage. But not everyone is kind to Janice.
People said that was a stupid thing to do. Well, maybe it was. My great-grandson, he's 7, and he said, I saw that, Grandma. What were you doing?
Probably not the smartest decision, but who are we to judge?
A year later, Stratton is sentenced to 15 years in prison. Janice wants to see her attacker in person, so she goes to court. But surprisingly, she feels sorry for him.
We're all sinners. We all make mistakes. He apologized. He was really sorry. He could not come up to me. He was over there with chains on, and I says, I forgive you. And he bowed his head and said, thank you.
And that kind of makes sense. We know that Janice is a member of the Christian faith. We know that she values things like forgiveness. And honestly, I've got a lot of respect for this take because I'm not sure I would have the same approach.
Still, Janice says if it happened again, she'd do things differently.
People do not realize the danger that is around us.
The purse is not worth your life. Stuff can be replaced, you can't.
Janice is still in therapy and suffers from dizzy spells and memory loss. But her sunny attitude never changes.
I know the Lord has a plan for all of us. I think He left me here for a reason. He wasn't finished with me yet.
Houston police still need your help to find a gang of criminals who may be responsible for more than a dozen burglaries.
Thieves targeting 2 other businesses in this area. They broke in through this window.
November 19th, 2018. The Timberwood area of Houston, Texas. 3 a.m. A brazen burglary is underway at a pizza restaurant.
They started smashing the glass with a crowbar. Then they climbed in.
This is breaking and entering 101.
That they've got their hoods up, they're wearing gloves, they're covered in head to toe, just trying to keep their identities concealed.
And these burglars have a unique technique. Get down low, crawl, then roll.
So we have motion detectors and they're part of the alarm. And that's probably why they were rolling around in the restaurant.
This looks like an action movie.
Like there's a laser beam that's going to touch them and the alarm's going to go off and the bars are going to shut down on top of them if they trigger the alarm.
They could also be, afraid of other like infrared cameras seeing them.
The thieves have either forgotten or maybe they just don't care, but the cameras are recording their every move.
And they head straight for the safe.
They knew directly where to go and how to get there. These guys were very prepared.
If they know someone's not in the area and it's worth the risk for them, they're gonna take it.
And with an assortment of tools ready, they immediately get to work.
They look around and they ransack. They're looking for anything that's of value. They smashed the safe with a crowbar, sledgehammer, anything they had.
These thieves cannot pry the safe open. They're beating the heck out of it, trying to get inside. And then at one point, we see one of them pull out their cell phone. They seem to be calling for help.
After about 30 minutes, they finally give up.
So even though they weren't able to open up the safe and get the money that they were looking for, they didn't want to leave empty-handed.
They did take my boombox, my drill, and my flashlight.
Their most baffling haul? Some children's toys.
A bunch of stuffed animals and things from the game room.
Then, crawling out the same way they came in, the thieves disappear into the night. Jesse learns about the theft when he arrives to open up a few hours later.
When we got to the store, we checked the cameras. We noticed they crawled around all over the restaurant to try to find the money.
Thankfully, the $2,000 that was locked in the safe remains untouched, but these bandits have caused another $2,000 in property damage for Jesse.
Well, these burglars, they need to be caught. They're a nuisance. They're a plague.
Angry, Jesse takes the video from the cameras he installed only 6 months earlier to the local news.
3 thieves rolling across the floor of a Mr. Gaddy's restaurant at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Well, they came over here with a crowbar and they sat there and smashed it about 20 times. These guys watch too much TV, too many movies.
The crooks are mocked for not thinking about the security cameras.
They made a serious miscalculation about where the surveillance camera was pointing.
And they get a catchy name.
Meet the Inchworm Bandits, huh?
The Inchworm Bandits.
The staff is actually taken to calling them the Inchworm Bandits.
It really just nods back to the fact of the movements that they were doing across the restaurant to try to keep low and do this really quietly. And it's also a catchy name.
Both police and the media soon realized that the same Inchworm crew is caught on multiple surveillance cameras, committing multiple burglaries.
It's just a style that seems to be happening all the time now. There's an audible alarm. They'll back away. They'll wait a little while, see if the police show up right away. If not, they start with crawling on the ground as slowly as possible.
I mean, they're inchworming their way across my dining room floor.
They like to hit the same type of establishments.
All these businesses are set up the exact same, so they know exactly where to go. Typically, it's like the manager's office or the cashier, the cash machines, the registers behind the counters.
And whoever they are, they're extremely well organized.
They'll have lookouts. You'll see a cell phone lit up or on speaker. They're getting the intel from outside. And so they know exactly how much time they have.
Jesse pleads with the band of bandits to stay away from small business owners.
I don't know, these guys need to get a life. They need something to do. Leave us alone. Get a job. Get to work. Everybody else in the area works hard. Why can't they?
And he hopes the public mocking will stop them.
They'll be too embarrassed to come out again.
But these thieves have other plans.
Wait for it. Jesse gets hit again. The bandits return, and this time,
they grind the safe open.
Incredibly, 1 year after brazen robbers hit Jesse's restaurant, they come back to steal from him again.
You know, there's so much work out there, but these guys, they feel it's easier to just go out and rob from people like me. They bring in bigger tools.
They came prepared. They even had a grinder to cut open the safe.
They bring these power tools that are battery operated that will cut just as fast as anything else. They bring extra blades. They bring extra power tools, extra batteries, because they know how long it takes typically to get into these safes.
This time, they managed to get away with $3,000 cash.
Some of it was tips for servers. I know for certain it was the same guys. It was the same inchworm bandits that did it.
Jesse is stunned that the bold bandits had the nerve to hit him again.
We have motion sensors. We have glass breaks. We have a 24-hour monitoring, but the alarm system didn't work. You pay for a sense of protection, and these guys, they violated it.
The robbers continue to hit one restaurant after another, and they're especially fond of fast food chains.
Popeye's Chicken, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Church's, Taco Bell's, Pizza Hut. Anywhere where they know where those safes are at, they're hitting those locations.
I think it's highly organized. These guys are probably a crew of 15 of them that do it.
Police say the inchworm bandits have likely committed hundreds of robberies.
Thieves are targeting their pizza shops and neighboring businesses.
Thieves took nearly $6,000 from the 3 pizzerias.
And they believe it's part of a coordinated gang effort, where they'll just take the safe if they can't crack it.
These crews are coming from a lot of gangs. Some of these gangs are working together where typically they wouldn't. They want to go make some money.
The one thing that unites all gangs, money. And cash will make you do some strange things, like doing the inchworm at 3 a.m. at a pizza parlor with your boys.
A lot of those restaurants, they typically don't do the money drop. They have the safes there that they drop the money into. The accessibility to the cash is there, so that's what they're looking to get. Just if it's $5,000, $3,000, $2,000, that's a good score for them.
I'm pretty upset about it. I wish these guys would get caught.
The video caught on Jesse's security cameras from the first burglary captures what appears to be a getaway car, a silver SUV. But police don't have much else to go on.
So unfortunately, we're often left with really grainy video. And this is a burglar's best friend.
A lot of the videos are poor quality. Without some type of evidence left behind, cell phone, fingerprint, DNA evidence, it's very difficult to identify these suspects.
Even though there was a lot of talk online about these inchworm bandits being stupid or not just being the brightest criminals, at the end of the day, I think they actually did a pretty good job at their trade craft. That they take pretty great care in protecting their identities with wearing gloves, making sure they have baggy clothes on, keeping their hoods up and things like that. And also just hitting like local family businesses, knowing that these places probably don't have the money to equip some of this high-tech security.
This looks like nonsense, but it keeps on working.
These bandits seem to be fearless.
And unfortunately, because it's a nonviolent crime, the reality is those suspects aren't going to stay in jail or go to prison very long. There's consequences, but they're just not afraid of them.
These criminals may be getting away with it, but I'm not impressed until they start doing flips.
There's definitely an element to this where, you know, once you start to build up your confidence with committing a crime like this over and over, you definitely start to think that you're untouchable.
Some business owners are responding by putting their cash elsewhere.
We've had a lot of business start to leave their registers open in their their registers on top of the counter, kind of to signify, hey, look, there's nothing in here.
The restaurants might as well hang a big sign in the window that says, "We take all our money home at night."
As for Jesse, he's decided the best solution is to look at the bright side of things. He and his staff now use that video of the inchworm bandits rolling across the restaurant floor as a source of endless entertainment.
We look back at it, we laugh. Getting only hit twice in the grand scheme of things isn't too bad.
These inchworm bandits, they're going to mess up, and we're going to be there and catch them when we can. We're always going to be looking for them.
In New York, another bold theft is also caught on camera. December 27th, 2020, New York City. It's the holiday season, and Columbia University professor Victoria de Grazia is enjoying some time with her beloved dog, Luca.
Luca's 7 years old. He's a long-haired dachshund. He now reaches maturity. He's quite calm. He's very sweet.
On this afternoon, Victoria isn't feeling well.
I was resting because I had a cold.
So her partner takes Luca for his walk. He stops at a deli and ties Luca to the outdoor fruit stand, something Victoria has done countless times before.
Sort of like a controlled situation. I usually would put him completely under the fruit stand so he wasn't even visible, to any passersby when I would take him out, and then never for more than 5 minutes.
In New York City, it's not uncommon to see dogs just tied up with their leash right outside of a store.
In this country, health and safety laws usually prohibit dog owners from bringing their dogs into restaurants or stores. Most of the time, nothing bad happens.
But this time, that's not the case.
When the boyfriend comes outside, the dog is gone. Luca wasn't left outside for hours. He was only outside for a matter of minutes.
Victoria's partner runs back into the store to ask for help. They call the police, who arrive within minutes.
Thankfully, the store had video.
And what's on the video shocks everyone.
The first thing that we see in this video is the dog is sitting under a produce section, waiting for his owner to come back.
And we see the suspect pet the dog, not really doing anything that to a passersby may seem out of the ordinary.
And the dog's accepting this man.
Then the suspect unties the dog's leash and he flees with the dog.
Police tell them that dog thefts are far more common than people realize.
There are rings that operate to steal certain kinds of dogs. Unfortunately for Luca, the kind of dog he is makes him a target for people who make possibly thousands of dollars in a sale after the theft.
When Victoria's partner tells her what happened, she's devastated.
Came in and he looked ghastly, and he said Luca was stolen. Began to cry, began to think these terrifying feelings, and then what to do. I felt very bad for my partner because it could have been me.
It is very emotional. It's like losing somebody in your own family.
Luca's owner jumps into action to try to get him back.
We made him signs. Have you seen this dog? Please give us information. This is a family dog. Please return the dog as soon as you can. We love Luca.
The response is instant, and soon The whole neighborhood is looking for Luca.
Lots of people helping. Tack, 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 these signs all over. The police, they also began to distribute flyers. And they put that onto the television.
Awful. A family pet was snatched from outside of a deli on the Upper West Side, and the owners are just devastated. The dog napper is apparently not very shy about the crime.
Why do you think someone would steal a dog?
Tens of thousands of people knew about this.
The story really starts to go viral. The social media reaction goes around like a wildfire. Even the NYPD 24th Precinct shares information about Luca on their Twitter account.
But police also warn Victoria that many stolen dogs are never recovered.
We were courting danger.
The potential for danger and the potential for death is certainly there.
As a whole city seems to fret about who has snatched Luca, tips pour in.
An avalanche of tips came in. Lots of people reported having maybe seen the suspect walking through the neighborhood. The reaction that occurred was incredible. Detectives, they worked into their caseload a tremendous effort to locate Luca.
Then, 3 days after Luca disappears, Victoria gets a surprising call.
From a woman in a little bottega, a little store. She said that Sunday night, the night Luca was stolen, a guy had come into her store with a dog and was trying to sell it to her.
The woman tells Victoria the man's behavior made her suspicious.
She said, I'm not interested, I have a dog. Besides, that dog looks to me like he was stolen. And he ran out. She saw him go into the next store.
The woman suspects that after he left her store and went to another one, the man found someone who was willing to buy the dog.
He went in and he came out with some money.
She's seen the news coverage about Luca and wants to help. So she sends Victoria images from her security camera.
I had looked at the email, and there was the guy with Luca in his arms.
Victoria immediately notifies the police.
They went and questioned the store owner where the dog was reportedly sold.
This store owner confirms that a man who came in that night did sell a dog to one of his customers. He tells police exactly where that person lives, so they head there to find out if the dog is indeed Luca. A few hours later, Victoria gets another call.
I really didn't think I'd see him again. I got a call. We have the dog, and we'll be bringing him home. His fur looked a little spiky. He was still sort of embarrassed looking and went and hid under the bed for several hours. And then the next day he was himself.
Thankfully for Victoria, Luca was recovered safely and they're able to be a happy family again.
Here he is, his little furry self. Very sweet, you're sweet, okay. There he is.
Just a few days after he's reunited with Victoria, authorities track down Luca's dog napper. He's charged with grand larceny. The person who he sold Luca to is not charged. And frightening as it all was, now everyone knows Luca as the dog-snatching survivor.
When we walk down the street, people say, is that the Luca? Is that the Luca? You know, he's like a little celebrity.
For Victoria, the ordeal has renewed her faith in mankind.
It was quite an amazing 4 days of people responding and collaborating. It made you believe totally in humankind.
And it's a Christmas she'll never forget.
This truly was a post-Christmas miracle.
We were so heartbroken and we were so happy when he came back. It ended up being a nice Christmas story.
At 2:17 a.m., a payphone on the edge of Highway 59 rang once, then went dead, and in the police log it was reduced to a line of ink that never learned how to scream, a call placed and disconnected, no voice recorded, no number traced, just the faint suggestion that someone had tried, at the last possible second, to say something they were no longer allowed to say. Texas, summer of 1987, the heat sitting low and heavy over a town that prided itself on quiet nights and unlocked doors, a place where headlights passing after midnight were noticed, remembered, sometimes talked about the next morning over burnt coffee and folded newspapers. By sunrise, the town would wake to the word cold case before it even knew what the cold meant, because the shock came first, then the silence, and only later the years. The scene was ordinary enough to feel wrong, a gravel pull-off behind a shuttered feed store, dust pressed flat by tire marks that led nowhere anyone could agree on, a single shoe lying on its side as if it had been dropped mid-step, laces still tied, the leather scuffed but intact. Deputies arrived with that early morning stiffness, radios murmuring, boots crunching softly as if the ground itself might wake up angry. No blood. No signs of a struggle that made sense. Just absence, shaped like a person everyone swore they had seen the day before. The name would be spoken carefully at first, then too often, then not at all, as if repetition could either summon the missing back or erase the fear that came with knowing they did not come home. The victim was not a stranger and not famous, which in small towns can be worse than either. A clerk at a hardware store, a high school graduate who stayed close to family, the kind of life that leaves a paper trail made of receipts and routines. Last seen just after closing, a wave to a coworker, a joke about the heat, a car turning onto the highway and then dissolving into the dark. By morning, the community gathered in tight clusters, trading timelines like currency, everyone certain they held the detail that would unlock the mystery. A missing person case hardened into something colder by the hour, because the longer a body is absent, the louder the questions become. Investigators worked the first 48 hours with urgency sharpened by pride, canvassing nearby gas stations, knocking on doors where porch lights flickered on in irritation and fear, collecting statements that contradicted each other just enough to feel human. A pickup truck seen idling. A man at the payphone, maybe, maybe not. A stranger asking for directions he should not have needed. Each detail landed on a board back at the station, pinned and repinned until the pins bent. They brought in dogs that circled and circled and then stopped, confused by the abundance of scents that led everywhere and nowhere at once. The highway became a suspect. So did the town. By the end of the week, the headlines arrived with the blunt force of a verdict: Texas 1987 cold case cracked, suspect found living under new identity. The words moved faster than the facts, leaping from radio to television to folded newsprint before the ink on the warrants was even dry. A man had been located in another county, working under a name that did not match his birth certificate, a face some claimed to recognize once the photograph was printed large enough. The community exhaled. Closure was promised in syllables bold enough to feel like truth. But inside the investigation rooms, the mood was less triumphant, the files still thin, the timelines still arguing with themselves. Because a suspect is not an answer, and a new identity is not a confession. The man denied knowing the victim, denied ever being near the feed store, denied the phone call, denied the shoe, denied the night itself. His paperwork was clean enough to pass at a glance, dirty enough to raise eyebrows when examined too closely. He had moved when asked, changed jobs without fuss, left behind towns that remembered him as quiet, helpful, forgettable. Detectives leaned on him with the practiced weight of long interviews, watching for cracks that never quite formed. He told the same story in the same order, and if that consistency felt rehearsed, it also felt unbreakable. As the weeks bled into months, the town learned the vocabulary of unresolved loss. Man wa ky la, the strange clue that promised everything and delivered nothing. A set of keys found in a ditch miles away, rusted just enough to suggest time but not enough to prove it. A witness who came forward late, then earlier, then not at all, their memory shifting under the pressure of attention. The hardware store kept the victim's schedule posted out of habit, then took it down quietly, as if admitting that the routine would never be resumed. The family spoke in public with composure and in private with a grief that did not follow any calendar. The investigation stalled where it always does, in the space between what can be proven and what can be felt. Evidence degraded. Leads evaporated. The suspect's new name became both shield and spotlight, protecting him from charges while ensuring he would never be invisible again. Rumors hardened into beliefs, beliefs into accusations that lived in glances and half-finished sentences. Some said the case had been cracked and the system simply lacked the courage to finish it. Others said the wrong man had been dragged into the light to satisfy a headline that arrived too early and refused to leave. Years passed, then decades, and the case cooled in the way only time can manage, not by erasing the heat but by spreading it thin until it seemed survivable. The file grew heavier as it aged, paper curling at the edges, photographs yellowing, a timeline that no longer fit on one wall. New detectives inherited old questions, learned the names like a ritual, promised fresh eyes and delivered the same frustration. The payphone was removed. The feed store was demolished. The highway widened, lanes added like a scar stretched longer rather than healed. And still, late at night, someone would mention the call that rang once and went dead, the shoe that never found its pair, the suspect who lived on under a borrowed name while a town waited for a truth that refused to surface. The headline remained, a claim suspended in time, daring anyone to prove it wrong or finally make it right, while the cold case stayed cold, not because no one cared, but because caring had not been enough to make the missing come home. The problem with time is that it doesn't move evenly, it accelerates in the moments nobody is watching and freezes whenever someone tries to remember, and by the second year of the investigation the town had learned how to live inside that distortion. The case file sat on a metal shelf, thick enough to bow the brackets, while outside life continued with an almost offensive normalcy. Football seasons came and went, marriages were announced in the same paper that once screamed cold case. Children grew tall enough to ask questions their parents didn't know how to answer. Every anniversary reopened the wound in public, a candlelight vigil on the courthouse steps, names spoken into microphones that crackled and swallowed the endings. And somewhere in the crowd the quiet suspicion that whatever had happened back in 1987 had not been finished, only paused. Detectives revisited the night as if it were a physical location they could walk through again, pacing the timeline, stopping at corners that felt wrong. The victim left work at 10:43 p.m., that much was solid, corroborated by a time-stamped receipt and a co-worker's statement delivered with the confidence of routine. The car headed north, or south, depending on which witness you believed, a detail that split the investigation early and never fully healed. One man insisted he saw taillights turning toward the highway, another swore he saw headlights pulling into the gravel behind the feed store, both certain, both believable, both wrong in ways that mattered. The shoe became a symbol, photographed from every angle, measured, bagged, unbagged, and discussed until it felt heavier than leather had any right to be. It didn't belong where it was found, that much everyone agreed on, but that agreement only deepened the mystery. No drag marks. No blood. No clear reason it should be there at all. Some argued it had been placed, a theatrical flourish meant to distract, others believed it was the accidental confession of a struggle that had ended too quickly to leave evidence. The lab found nothing that could survive a courtroom. Dirt. Fibers common enough to be meaningless. The shoe waited, patient, while theories piled up around it. The suspect with the new identity hovered at the edge of every discussion, a ghost made of paperwork and denials. He had been in the county around the time of the disappearance, that was true, his presence confirmed by payroll records and a rental agreement that placed him uncomfortably close to the feed store. He knew the highway. He used payphones. He had a history of leaving towns without saying goodbye. But proximity is not guilt, and habits are not proof, and every attempt to tighten the net only seemed to give him more room to breathe. When questioned years later, he remembered the summer as hot, the work as steady, the nights as uneventful, a blandness so complete it almost felt like camouflage. The call at 2:17 a.m. haunted the investigation like a clock that refused to stop ticking. It came from a payphone now long gone, its metal shell removed and sold for scrap, but the record remained, a timestamp without a voice. The operator remembered nothing. The logs told only half a story. Some believed the victim made the call, others argued it was the suspect, a test of courage or a mistake made under pressure. There was a theory that the call was unrelated, an innocent coincidence elevated by desperation into something sinister. Each version carried its own implications, and none could be proven without the one thing the case lacked: a body, a confession, a moment that refused to stay buried. As the years deepened, the investigation took on a ritualistic quality, reopening every time a new detective arrived with fresh resolve and left with the same questions. Old witnesses were re-interviewed, their memories softened by time, sharpened by retelling, altered by the stories they had heard others tell. A man who once remembered a truck now remembered a van. A woman who swore she heard shouting later admitted she might have mistaken it for laughter. Memory became a terrain as treacherous as the physical landscape, shifting underfoot, impossible to map. The community's relationship with the case changed in subtle ways. At first, there was fear, the sense that something terrible had happened and could happen again. Then came anger, directed at law enforcement, at the suspect, at fate itself. Finally, there was a weary acceptance that settled like dust, not forgiveness, not closure, but the dull ache of an unanswered question carried for too long. New residents heard the story as a cautionary tale, told at barbecues and late-night gatherings, a reminder that even quiet places have shadows they don't talk about. The headline that once promised resolution lingered like an unkept oath. Texas 1987 cold case cracked suggested an ending that never arrived, a verdict that lived only in type. Each time the suspect was spotted under his assumed name, buying groceries, attending church, shaking hands at work events, the sighting reignited the debate. Some saw a monster hiding in plain sight. Others saw a man trapped by a rumor he could never outrun. The law hovered between those positions, bound by standards that refused to bend for feelings alone. Investigators chased new leads that emerged from unlikely places. A letter sent anonymously claimed knowledge of a burial site, leading to a fruitless excavation that unearthed nothing but bones from livestock and the embarrassment of false hope. A tip from another state suggested the victim had been seen years later, alive, working under a different name, a mirror image of the suspect's story that collapsed under scrutiny. Each lead demanded attention, resources, belief, and each ended the same way, with a file marked inactive and a sense of momentum lost. Technology crept forward, offering tools that hadn't existed in 1987. DNA databases expanded. Fingerprint systems became digital. Cold case units formed with the promise of revival. The evidence was re-examined under new lights, swabbed again, scanned again, but absence does not yield to technology. Without remains, without biological material, science could only confirm what was already known, that nothing definitive had been left behind. The case resisted modernization, stubbornly analog, anchored to a night that refused to be translated into data. The victim's family aged in parallel with the investigation, their grief evolving into something quieter but no less present. They learned to answer questions from reporters with practiced phrases, learned when to speak and when silence said more. Birthdays passed with empty chairs, holidays with traditions altered to accommodate loss. They pushed for answers not out of vengeance but out of a need to complete a story that had been interrupted mid-sentence. Each year without resolution felt like an accusation against time itself. The suspect, meanwhile, built a life that was both ordinary and defensive. He married. He worked. He paid taxes under a name that fit him like a borrowed coat. When confronted by the past, he expressed frustration, then resignation, then a kind of weary defiance. He knew the case would follow him until he died or the truth surfaced, whichever came first. In interviews, he asked the same question again and again: if he were guilty, why had nothing ever been found? It was a question no one could answer without stepping into the realm of speculation, and speculation was all the case seemed to have left. By the late 2000s, the investigation existed in a strange limbo, neither active nor forgotten, revived periodically by anniversaries, documentaries, or a new generation's fascination with unresolved crime. The term cold case took on a marketing quality, a hook for attention, but for those closest to it, the cold was not absence of emotion, it was the preservation of pain, kept intact by the lack of resolution. The case was not dead, it was suspended, waiting for something to tip the balance. And through it all, the night of the disappearance remained untouched, a fixed point everyone circled without ever reaching. The highway at 2:17 a.m., the payphone's hollow ring, the shoe lying where it should not have been, the suspect living a parallel life under a parallel name. The story refused to close, refused to soften, refused to explain itself, leaving behind a tension that stretched across decades, humming quietly, daring someone to finally pull hard enough to make it break. What made the case dangerous was not just what was missing, but what remained, the fragments that refused to decay, the way certain details stayed sharp while everything else blurred. And by the third decade, investigators understood they were no longer chasing a crime so much as a narrative that had learned how to defend itself. Every time someone thought they had found the crack, the story shifted, absorbed the pressure, and settled back into its familiar shape. The cold case had grown an instinct for survival. The feed store's demolition changed something fundamental. For years it had been a physical anchor, a place detectives could stand and point to, explaining to new partners where the shoe had been found, where the gravel dipped, where a car could have idled unnoticed. When it was torn down, replaced by a slab of concrete and a nondescript warehouse, the geography lost its authority. The past no longer had a place to return to. Photographs became the only proof that the scene had ever existed at all, grainy images of a world that no longer matched reality. That loss pushed investigators inward, back to people, back to psychology, back to motive. They asked the same question in different ways: why here, why that night, why this victim? The answers never aligned. The victim had no known enemies, no debts worth killing over, no secret life anyone could convincingly argue for. The ordinariness became suspicious, as if normalcy itself were a disguise. Some theorized it was random, a wrong place, wrong time scenario, violence without a reason that could be named. Others insisted randomness was a comforting lie, that every crime has a logic, even if it is ugly or small. The suspect with the new identity fit too easily into certain versions of that logic. He had drifted into town months earlier, taken a job that put him on the same roads at the same hours as the victim, learned the rhythms of the place without ever committing to it. He left shortly after the disappearance, citing better opportunities elsewhere, a coincidence that felt heavy enough to bend conversations around it. Yet each time detectives pushed for something concrete, the ground gave way. No witness placed him at the scene. No forensic link tied him to the shoe, the phone, the car. His life before and after the move remained unremarkable, a chain of ordinary decisions that refused to add up to murder. As the case aged, it attracted attention from outside the county: journalists, podcasters, amateur investigators drawn by the promise embedded in the phrase "cold case cracked." They arrived with microphones and theories, asking questions locals had learned to avoid. Some brought new energy, others brought noise. They uncovered small inconsistencies in early reports, misstatements that had calcified into facts over time. A time logged incorrectly. A witness misquoted. Each correction shifted the story just enough to keep it alive, but never enough to solve it. The family watched this resurgence with mixed emotions. Attention meant pressure, pressure meant possibility, but it also meant reopening wounds that had learned to scar over. They participated when they could, declined when they couldn't, navigating a public grief that never quite became private. The victim's room remained intact longer than anyone admitted, a museum of paused life that eventually had to be dismantled for survival. Even then, certain items were kept: a jacket, a photograph, proof that the missing person had once occupied space in the world. One detail resurfaced during a routine audit of old evidence, something that had been noted early and then quietly sidelined: a partial set of tire impressions near the gravel pull-off, too faint to classify at the time, dismissed as contamination from passing vehicles. Advances in pattern analysis allowed a second look, and what emerged was not a match but a suggestion: a consistency in width and tread that pointed to a limited range of trucks popular in the late 1980s. It wasn't enough for charges, but it narrowed the universe. The suspect owned such a vehicle back then. So did half the county. The finding was both promising and cruel. The phone call became louder in the retelling, the imagined voice clearer even as the real one remained silent. Some investigators leaned into the idea that it was a cry for help, cut short by violence. Others believed it was a misdirection, a calculated act meant to establish an alibi or test the waters. The fact that it rang once and went dead took on symbolic weight, interpreted as panic, interruption, or hesitation depending on who was telling the story. The truth, if it existed, was locked inside a moment nobody had witnessed. The suspect's life under the new identity grew increasingly documented as the years went on. Social media arrived, bringing with it a trail of photographs and posts that made hiding both easier and harder. He appeared at weddings, birthdays, company picnics, smiling in a way that some found chilling and others found mundane. Every image sparked commentary, armchair analysis of body language, eyes scanned for guilt or fear. He responded rarely, retreating further into a careful anonymity that only fueled suspicion. To some, the silence was proof. To others, it was self-preservation. Law enforcement faced a different kind of pressure now, one shaped by hindsight and public scrutiny. Mistakes made in 1987 were judged by modern standards, procedures that hadn't existed then treated as obvious omissions. Detectives defended their predecessors while quietly acknowledging the limits they had worked under. The case became a lesson taught in training rooms, an example of how quickly an investigation can harden into myth if not resolved early. But lessons do not resurrect the missing. A new theory gained traction briefly, suggesting the victim may have left voluntarily, staged the scene, shed the shoe to suggest foul play, and disappeared into a new life. It appealed to those desperate for an ending that did not involve death. The theory collapsed under the weight of practicality. The victim had no preparation, no financial trail, no sightings that survived scrutiny. The idea lingered anyway, because hope is stubborn, and sometimes denial is gentler than truth. Every few years, a rumor surfaced about a burial site, a stretch of land rumored to hide more than cattle bones. Ground-penetrating radar swept fields and forests, each scan a promise, each negative result another door closing quietly. The landscape absorbed these intrusions without complaint, offering nothing in return. Nature, it seemed, was complicit in the silence. The suspect aged, as everyone did, his hair thinning, his posture stiffening, his patience wearing down. He granted one interview late in life, speaking calmly about the weight of being associated with a crime that had never been proven. He denied involvement again, not angrily, not defensively, but with the fatigue of a man who had repeated the same sentence for decades. He said the case had taken something from him too, a normal existence, the luxury of being unknown. The statement angered some, resonated with others, and changed nothing. Inside the case file, a note written years earlier gained new attention, a margin scribble by a detective long retired, questioning a small gap in the timeline no one had fully addressed. A 15-minute window between the victim leaving work and the last confirmed sighting of the car. It was a sliver of time, easily dismissed, but now it felt like a doorway. Investigators reconstructed routes, drove them at different speeds, accounting for traffic patterns long gone. The exercise produced possibilities, not answers, but it reminded everyone how little time it takes for a life to vanish. The community carried the case like a shared memory that no longer belonged to any one person. New tragedies came and went, crimes solved, others forgotten, but this one remained, an unfinished sentence at the end of the town's story. It was referenced obliquely, with a look or a pause, a reminder that certainty is fragile. Parents warned children not with explicit fear, but with a subtle caution about nights and roads and strangers. As the 30th anniversary passed, the language around the case softened in public but sharpened in private. Officials stopped promising resolution, opting instead for commitment, a vow to keep the file open, to follow any credible lead. The phrase "cold case cracked" began to sound ironic, almost cruel, a headline that had outrun reality and left everyone else to catch up. The truth, if it existed in a single, coherent form, remained elusive, scattered across decades, hidden in ordinary decisions and unremarkable moments. Somewhere between the payphone's ring and the suspect's borrowed name, between the shoe on the gravel and the road that kept stretching forward, lay an explanation that refused to surface. The case endured not because it was dramatic, but because it was incomplete, a reminder that some stories resist endings, lingering instead as questions that echo long after the sound that created them has faded. By the time the 40th year loomed on the horizon, the case had entered a phase investigators rarely talk about, the stage where persistence becomes indistinguishable from obsession, and yet quitting feels like a second crime layered over the first. Files were digitized, then redigitized, scanned at higher resolutions, every photograph sharpened until the grain itself became a subject of debate. The old audio tapes were cleaned, hiss reduced, silences magnified, as if something might finally speak from the static. Nothing did. Silence remained the most consistent witness. The 15-minute gap identified years earlier began to dominate conversations. It was small enough to be ignored, large enough to hide an entire life-altering event. Detectives rebuilt that window second by second, mapping out possible routes, factoring in stoplights that no longer existed, speed limits that had changed, the habits of drivers in a town that had once moved slower. They drove the routes at night, at dawn, in the heat, in the rain, trying to feel what the victim might have felt, trying to make the past press back. The exercise yielded patterns, not answers, but it reframed the night as something tighter, more compressed, less sprawling than memory had made it. A new generation of investigators brought a different tone, less theatrical, more methodical, suspicious of legends. They questioned assumptions that had hardened into facts simply because they had been repeated long enough. Was the shoe really dropped during a struggle, or could it have fallen from the car earlier, unnoticed until later? Was the payphone call truly connected, or had the case been bent around it because humans crave symbols? These questions angered some veterans, comforted others, and unsettled the family, who feared that re-examining everything might mean starting over with nothing. The suspect's name, both the original and the adopted, had become shorthand, a linguistic shortcut for all that was unresolved. Every time a tip came in, it circled back to him, as if gravity itself pulled suspicion in his direction. Yet time had eroded the urgency that once surrounded him. He was older now, less mobile, his life predictable to the point of monotony. Surveillance yielded routines so boring they felt almost strategic. He drove to work. He came home. He watched television. If guilt was there, it hid behind an unremarkable existence that left no room for drama. One development cut through the fog briefly, a financial record unearthed during a broader audit of 1980s banking practices. A small cash withdrawal made near the highway the morning after the disappearance, an amount too modest to scream escape but too precise to ignore. The account belonged to someone connected to the suspect's circle at the time, a co-worker who had since died, taking his explanations with him. The withdrawal became a question mark, a potential link that could neither be confirmed nor dismissed. It joined the constellation of almosts that defined the case. The community's memory of the victim began to blur at the edges, not out of indifference but necessity. Stories grew inconsistent, details softened, the person at the center gradually replaced by the idea of loss itself. Memorials shifted tone, less about demanding justice, more about remembrance. The victim's name was etched into stone alongside dates that felt incomplete, a dash separating birth from disappearance, an entire future reduced to punctuation. Visitors stood there quietly, confronting the fact that some timelines do not close. Media attention ebbed and flowed, driven by anniversaries and the rise of true crime culture. Each resurgence brought new audiences who consumed the story quickly, intensely, and then moved on. For those living with it, the cycle was exhausting. They watched strangers debate theories online, assign guilt with confidence, dismiss complexity with the certainty of distance. The case became content, stripped of its weight, even as it continued to define real lives. Inside law enforcement, the case served as both burden and benchmark. It was cited when arguing for resources, a reminder of what happens when early momentum is lost. It was used to justify cold case units, to defend the idea that time does not have to be an enemy if patience is institutionalized. Yet patience has limits, especially when witnesses age out, memories fade, and suspects die without speaking. Every year that passed narrowed the possibilities, not by clarifying them, but by eliminating paths entirely. A retired detective returned to the case unexpectedly, driven not by orders but by restlessness. He brought with him a notebook filled with observations that had never made it into official reports, impressions dismissed at the time as intuition. He spoke of a feeling at the scene, a sense that the absence was too clean, that something had been planned rather than exploded into being. His notes were careful to avoid accusations, but they hinted at deliberation, at a mind working ahead of the moment. Younger investigators listened, skeptical but curious, aware that instinct, while unprovable, had sometimes pointed in the right direction before evidence could catch up. The suspect declined further interviews, citing health and exhaustion. His lawyer issued statements that grew shorter over time, reiterating innocence, condemning speculation, warning against trial by narrative. The refusal fed suspicion, but it also aligned with advice any defense attorney would give after decades of scrutiny. Silence, again, proved ambiguous, capable of meaning anything and nothing at once. The physical evidence, sparse as it was, underwent one more review. The shoe was examined for wear patterns, the way the sole had compressed, the scuffs that hinted at gait. An analyst suggested the wearer might have been running, or at least moving quickly, but the conclusion was framed cautiously, a probability, not a claim. The keys found years earlier were re-examined, their scratches mapped, their origins traced to a model of car that had since vanished from roads. Each finding nudged the case forward by inches, never miles. One night, during a storm that rattled windows and knocked out power across the county, an officer drove the highway alone, radio silent, rain flattening the world into reflective black. He stopped near where the payphone had once stood, the ground now unmarked, anonymous. The moment was not official, not documented, but it lingered with him, the sense that the case was not anchored to objects or locations anymore, but to an unresolved tension that existed independently of proof. It was a feeling he could not log, could not file, but could not shake. The family faced a decision many in their position eventually confront: how long to wait for answers before redefining what answers mean. They spoke privately about acceptance, about the difference between closure and peace, about whether the two had ever truly been the same. Publicly, they continued to ask for information, to cooperate, to hope. Privately, they prepared for the possibility that the truth might never arrive in a form they recognized. As the years stacked up, the language around the case shifted subtly. Officials stopped using the word cracked altogether, favoring ongoing, active, under review. The old headline felt like an artifact from a more competent time, a promise made before anyone understood how deep the silence went. It hung over the investigation like a dare, a reminder of the gap between what had been declared and what had been delivered. The town itself changed, expanding outward, absorbing newcomers who knew nothing of 1987 until they were told. For them, the story was history, distant, almost abstract. For longtime residents, it was a shadow that moved with them, stretching or shrinking depending on the light. They measured time by other events now, but the disappearance remained a reference point, a before and after that refused to fade completely. In the end, the case persisted not because of a single unanswered question, but because of many, layered and interdependent, each one propping up the others. The 15-minute gap. The payphone call. The shoe. The suspect's new identity. The life that continued alongside a life that had stopped. Together, they formed a structure too complex to collapse easily, too fragile to resolve without precision. And so the story continued, not forward, not backward, but outward, radiating into lives and conversations, shaping caution and curiosity in equal measure. Somewhere within that expansion lay the truth, intact or fragmented, waiting for a convergence that had not yet occurred. Until then, the cold case remained what it had always been, not a failure of effort, but a testament to how completely a moment can disappear, leaving behind only the echo of what might have been said if the call had lasted longer, if the night had given up its secrets, if time itself had been less willing to keep them. What unsettled investigators most was not the lack of evidence, but the way the case seemed to resist gravity, how nothing ever quite settled at the bottom where truth was supposed to collect. Each revisit produced motion, meetings, memos, renewed interviews, but no weight. It was as if the disappearance existed in a vacuum, untouched by the usual forces that pull crimes toward resolution. The longer it remained unresolved, the more it seemed to define its own rules. A subtle shift occurred when a former acquaintance of the victim came forward, decades late, carrying a memory he had never fully trusted. He described a brief conversation in the days before the disappearance, a throwaway exchange about someone watching the hardware store at closing time, a presence that felt wrong but too vague to act on. At the time, it had registered as nothing more than a comment, easily lost among dozens of similar observations made in a small town where strangers stood out. Now, it felt heavier. Investigators listened carefully, aware of the risks of retrospective clarity, the way memories can sharpen under the influence of everything learned since. The description was frustratingly imprecise, a man leaning against a truck, engine off, posture relaxed but eyes attentive. No face remembered clearly. No license plate. Just a feeling of being observed. The witness could not say whether it was the suspect or anyone else, only that the memory had stayed with him because it made no sense at the time. The statement added texture but not structure, another brushstroke on a canvas already crowded with half-formed images. Attention returned to the suspect's movements in the weeks surrounding the disappearance. Old employment records were cross-referenced with travel logs, pay stubs examined for anomalies. A pattern emerged that was almost invisible at first: short, unexplained absences from work, never long enough to raise alarms, always justified later with vague explanations. Taken individually, they meant nothing. Taken together, they suggested flexibility, a schedule that could bend without snapping. It was not proof. It was opportunity, the most dangerous word in any investigation. The suspect's adopted identity came under renewed scrutiny as well. The paperwork was legal, properly filed, but the timing raised questions. Why change names when he did? Why not earlier, or later? He explained it as a desire for a fresh start, a common enough motive, but investigators noted how neatly it coincided with increased attention on the case. Again, coincidence hovered at the edge of suspicion, daring anyone to draw a straight line through it. The family received a call they had learned to dread and hope for in equal measure. Investigators wanted to review personal items again. Not because something new had been found, but because technology had advanced enough to justify another attempt. They agreed, handing over objects that had been returned years earlier, items that carried the residue of ordinary life. The process was clinical, respectful, and emotionally brutal. Each item was a reminder of proximity, of how close the victim had been to safety, to routine, to home. Nothing definitive emerged. Trace materials that might once have told a story had degraded beyond recognition. The science confirmed what time had already proven: absence compounds itself. The family absorbed the disappointment with practiced composure, the kind that looks like strength from the outside and feels like exhaustion from within. As the case pressed on, investigators explored a darker possibility, one that had always lingered but rarely been spoken aloud, that the body might never be found, not because it was hidden well, but because it had been erased by circumstance. The landscape had changed dramatically over the years. Construction projects, flooding, erosion, and development had reshaped entire stretches of land. A burial site that might once have been discoverable could now lie beneath concrete or water, inaccessible without dismantling the present. The idea reframed the search as something already lost, a truth buried beneath progress. The suspect's health declined, and with it, the window for certain answers narrowed. Detectives debated strategy quietly, weighing the ethics of pressure against the diminishing likelihood of confession. He had lived long enough with the accusation to understand its permanence. If guilt existed, it was comfortable. If innocence was real, it was hardened by decades of suspicion. Either way, time was no longer an ally. The community reacted to these developments with a mix of resignation and renewed curiosity. Some felt the case should be allowed to rest, its unanswered questions accepted as part of the town's history. Others believed that giving up would be an insult, not only to the victim, but to the idea that truth matters even when it is difficult to obtain. The divide was quiet but persistent, surfacing in letters to editors, in conversations that ended abruptly when opinions clashed. A single photograph began circulating again, an image taken years earlier at a public event, showing the suspect in the background, partially obscured, his expression unreadable. Analysts argued over nothing and everything, the angle of his head, the tension in his jaw, the direction of his gaze. It was a Rorschach test for belief, revealing more about the viewer than the subject. The photo proved nothing, but it reignited attention, reminding everyone how thin the line was between evidence and projection. Investigators returned to the notion of planning, the idea that the disappearance had not been spontaneous. The clean scene, the lack of witnesses, the precise timing all suggested forethought. If that was true, then the perpetrator had known the victim's routine, had anticipated the night's variables, had chosen a moment when chance would be least likely to interfere. That level of preparation implied familiarity, or at least observation. It narrowed the field conceptually while leaving it wide open practically. The 15-minute gap continued to loom, now less a window and more a funnel, drawing theories into its narrow mouth. It was the space where everything had to fit, where every explanation had to pass. Investigators imagined what could realistically happen in that time: a stop, a conversation, a sudden escalation, a forced detour. Each scenario ended the same way, with unanswered questions about where the victim had gone and why no trace remained. Late one evening, a junior detective asked a question that had somehow never been voiced aloud: what if the case had been mislabeled from the beginning? What if the disappearance was not a murder, but something that had gone wrong afterward, an accident compounded by fear, a mistake hidden rather than confessed? The idea unsettled the room. It did not absolve anyone, but it complicated everything. It suggested that the truth might be smaller and uglier than the grand narratives built around it. The question lingered, uncomfortably plausible, impossible to prove. It joined the others, not as a solution, but as a reminder that certainty was elusive. The case had survived because it could accommodate contradictions, because it could stretch to include new ideas without breaking. That flexibility made it resilient and maddening in equal measure. As another year closed, the case remained open, not in the sense of active pursuit, but in its refusal to conclude. It lived on in databases, in conversations, in the careful way people still talked about nights and highways. The suspect lived on too, under his chosen name, a parallel existence running beside the absence left behind. The story had no ending yet, only accumulation, detail stacked upon detail, pressure building without release. Somewhere, in that growing mass, lay the answer, compressed and hidden, waiting for a moment when something finally shifted enough to let it surface. Until then, the cold case endured, not frozen, but suspended, held in place by the collective inability to let it disappear the way the victim had. The longer the case lingered, the more it began to behave like a living thing, adapting to scrutiny, changing shape under pressure, retreating whenever someone thought they were close enough to touch it. By now, the investigation was less about discovery and more about endurance, about how long a question could be carried without breaking the people who held it. Detectives spoke of the case in lowered voices, not out of secrecy, but out of a shared superstition, as if speaking too loudly might remind it to hide again. A quiet breakthrough almost went unnoticed, buried in paperwork from an unrelated review. An old dispatch log revealed a minor discrepancy in timestamps from the night of the disappearance, a difference of minutes that had been dismissed decades earlier as clerical error. When recalculated against known call volumes and staffing levels, the discrepancy suggested the timeline might have been slightly misaligned from the start. Not enough to rewrite the night, but enough to shift emphasis, to suggest that certain movements previously thought impossible could, in fact, have occurred. This adjustment breathed new life into old routes. Investigators revisited the possibility of a brief stop somewhere between the hardware store and the highway, a place neither isolated nor public, a transitional space where chance encounters could turn dangerous. Parking lots, service roads, side streets that had since been paved over or renamed. Each location was evaluated not as it existed now, but as it had been then, poorly lit, half-finished, familiar to locals and invisible to outsiders. The town had been smaller, looser, full of gaps that no longer existed. One such location stood out not because of evidence, but because of absence. A short service road that once led to a closed-down warehouse, a place frequented by delivery trucks and night workers, a place where stopping would not attract attention. Records showed it had been demolished within 2 years of the disappearance, the land repurposed, the road erased. No reports mentioned it explicitly, but its proximity to the 15-minute gap made it impossible to ignore. Investigators wondered aloud how many places like it had existed, how many had vanished along with whatever might have happened there. The suspect's connection to that area was circumstantial but unsettling. His job at the time required occasional late-night access to nearby facilities, giving him a plausible reason to be familiar with the road. When asked about it years earlier, he had claimed no specific memory, a response so common it was almost meaningless. Yet the absence of denial, the lack of curiosity, left some investigators uneasy. Innocence, they believed, often came with questions. The case file absorbed this new angle quietly, without fanfare. No press release. No announcement. Just another layer added to an already thick record. Experience had taught everyone involved that publicity without proof only hardened positions and poisoned potential witnesses. If something was going to break, it would do so in silence. Meanwhile, the victim's family experienced a different kind of time pressure. Aging parents began to worry less about justice and more about understanding, about knowing enough to place their grief somewhere solid. They spoke privately about legacy, about what would be left behind if the truth never emerged. Their advocacy softened, not in determination, but in tone. They asked fewer questions of investigators and more of themselves, wondering how to live fully alongside an absence that refused to be resolved. The suspect sensed the shift too. His public statements ceased entirely. He withdrew from any setting where he might be questioned, even casually. Friends described him as guarded, not fearful, but alert, as if listening for a sound only he could hear. Whether this was guilt, paranoia, or the natural outcome of decades under suspicion was impossible to say. The effect, however, was the same: distance. A former co-worker of the suspect came forward with a detail so small it almost didn't survive the retelling. He recalled an offhand remark made shortly after the disappearance, a joke delivered without humor about how people vanish every day and most are never found. At the time, it had seemed philosophical, maybe even cynical. Now, stripped of context and examined under harsh light, it felt loaded. Investigators debated its value, aware that meaning assigned after the fact could distort intent. Still, the remark was logged, another fragment in a mosaic that refused to complete itself. The payphone returned to prominence, not as an object, but as a behavior. Analysts studied call patterns from similar cases, the psychology of last-minute communication. Why call and hang up? Panic? Interruption? Regret? Or rehearsal? The theories multiplied, each plausible, each unprovable. The call remained a punctuation mark without a sentence, a moment that demanded interpretation but offered no guidance. The case's presence in the community shifted again, becoming less a story told and more a silence maintained. People stopped bringing it up unless prompted. The disappearance became something everyone knew and no one discussed, a shared agreement to leave the wound covered. That silence was not peace. It was containment. In law enforcement circles, the case began to be referenced as an example of structural disappearance, a crime shaped as much by environment and timing as by intent. It was studied for what it revealed about blind spots, about how quickly a narrative can form and how hard it is to dismantle once it does. The lesson was sobering. Sometimes the most damaging assumption is that the truth will eventually surface on its own. Late one night, during a review session that stretched past exhaustion, an investigator posed a question that landed heavily in the room. What if the reason the case had survived so long was because the truth was too ordinary to recognize? Not a grand plot, not a monstrous stranger, not a perfectly executed plan, but a sequence of small decisions made under pressure, each one narrowing the options until disappearance became the only outcome. The idea stripped the case of drama and replaced it with inevitability. No one answered. The silence felt appropriate. The service road, the time discrepancy, the casual remark, the phone call that went nowhere, none of it resolved into clarity. Instead, it formed a tighter knot, pulling the story inward. The case was no longer expanding, it was compressing, becoming denser, heavier, harder to move. Every new detail did not open doors, it closed them. As another year passed, the investigation continued in this narrowed state, focused, restrained, almost surgical. There was no rush left, no illusion of sudden revelation. Only the slow, deliberate examination of what had been missed, what had been misread, what had been assumed too quickly. The cold case remained unsolved, not because it lacked attention, but because it existed at the intersection of chance and choice, where evidence thinned and intention blurred. Somewhere in that intersection, the truth waited, small enough to be overlooked, heavy enough to matter. And until it was found, or until time finally ran out, it would continue to exert its quiet pressure, shaping lives not through answers, but through the persistent, unrelenting weight of what was still unknown. By now, the case no longer asked for belief, it demanded patience, the kind that wears grooves into the people who practice it. Investigators felt it in their bodies, the fatigue that came not from long hours but from circular motion, the sense of walking the same ground until the path itself became smooth. Yet even in that repetition, something subtle shifted. The story began to feel smaller, tighter, less mythic, as if the truth were compressing inward, shedding excess interpretations that time had layered on. A pattern emerged in hindsight that no one had named before. Every meaningful lead arrived quietly, without spectacle, almost embarrassed by its own existence. The loud tips went nowhere. The dramatic theories collapsed. What remained were modest inconsistencies, human slips, the residue of ordinary behavior under stress. Investigators learned to listen for those details, to distrust anything that arrived fully formed. The service road returned again, this time not as a location but as a concept, a reminder of how many transitional spaces had existed in 1987 and no longer did. Places where people paused briefly, where routine bent just enough to allow deviation. Gas stations before cameras. Warehouses before security lighting. Lots that served no purpose after dark except convenience. The town had been full of them, and each one represented a moment where something could have gone wrong without witnesses. A former city planner, now retired, was consulted almost accidentally, asked about development records from the late 80s. He mentioned, casually, that several temporary access roads had existed during a construction project near the highway that summer, paths created for equipment and later erased. The records were incomplete, the permits vague, but the implication was unsettling. There had been more ways off the main road than anyone remembered. More exits from the night. Investigators mapped these forgotten paths onto the revised timeline, overlaying them with the 15-minute gap. The exercise did not reveal a single route, but it did reveal possibility. A car could have left the highway briefly and returned without drawing attention. A stop could have occurred in darkness that no longer existed. The past, it seemed, had been more porous than the present. The suspect's familiarity with the area gained new weight in this context. His work had placed him near construction zones, around temporary access points, in spaces outsiders would have ignored. When asked years earlier about that period, he had spoken generally, his answers broad enough to accommodate almost anything. At the time, it had seemed like evasiveness. Now it felt like alignment, a narrative flexible enough to survive scrutiny because it never committed to specifics. The family sensed the shift before it was explained to them. Investigators spoke differently now, less speculative, more careful, their questions narrower, their pauses longer. They no longer promised progress. They asked instead for patience, for trust, for the understanding that some truths reveal themselves only when enough false versions have been exhausted. The family nodded, having learned long ago that hope did not always arrive dressed as optimism. Publicly, the case had faded into the background of larger, louder stories. Privately, it intensified. Detectives met in small groups, debated quietly, argued not over suspects but over sequences. The order of events mattered more than who had caused them. What happened first? What followed? What decision closed off alternatives? The case was becoming chronological rather than accusatory, an attempt to rebuild motion rather than assign blame. The suspect's silence deepened. He avoided even indirect contact, declined social events, reduced his public footprint to almost nothing. Friends described him as cautious, deliberate, a man who measured his words even in casual conversation. Some interpreted this as fear. Others saw it as discipline. Both interpretations fed the same unease. He was aware of the story being told about him, and he was positioning himself outside of it. A medical event briefly altered the trajectory. The suspect was hospitalized for a non-life-threatening condition, and rumors spread quickly, speculation ignited by the possibility that time might finally force a confession. None came. He recovered, returned home, and resumed his quiet routines. The moment passed, leaving behind only the uncomfortable realization that the window for certain answers was narrowing further. Investigators revisited the possibility of an accomplice, not in a grand sense, but as a facilitator, someone whose presence reduced risk without leaving fingerprints. A coworker. A friend. Someone who didn't need to know everything, only enough. The theory fit the case's restraint, its lack of spectacle. It also fit the way suspicion had diffused over time, never settling fully on one person. Yet again, proof remained elusive. The payphone, the service road, the forgotten access points, the 15-minute gap, all of it began to feel less like separate mysteries and more like components of a single mechanism. Remove one piece, and the rest still functioned. That resilience suggested design, or at least adaptation. Whatever had happened that night had not relied on perfection, only on enough things going right at the same time. The community's silence grew heavier. The case was no longer a topic of debate, but of avoidance. People lowered their voices when it came up, glanced around as if someone might overhear. Not because they feared retaliation, but because the story had become too close, too embedded in local identity. It was easier to live around it than through it. Late in the investigation, a note surfaced from an early interview that had never been fully transcribed, a sentence cut off mid-thought, the rest lost to tape degradation. The surviving words described the victim as in a hurry, but not scared. The distinction mattered. It suggested intent, purpose, movement towards something rather than away from it. Investigators argued about what that meant. A meeting planned? A routine deviation? Or simply the impatience of someone ready to go home? The fragment lingered, incomplete but provocative. It joined the case's vocabulary, another phrase repeated carefully, tested against theories, never allowed to settle into certainty. The story was learning to speak in fragments, and those fragments were beginning to align. As the seventh phase of the investigation drew to a close, there was no announcement, no revelation, no sense of triumph. Instead, there was a tightening, a collective awareness that the space for interpretation was shrinking. The case was not opening outward anymore. It was folding in on itself, approaching something dense and difficult. Whether that something was truth or merely the end of possibility remained unclear. But for the first time in years, investigators felt they were not chasing shadows across an open field, but pressing against a wall, solid and unyielding, waiting for the smallest crack to appear. Pressure changes behavior. That was the principle guiding the investigation now, not force, not exposure, but proximity, the slow narrowing of space until something had to give. The case had reached a point where it could no longer expand with new theories, it could only compress existing ones, squeeze them until the weak seams showed. Every detail was revisited not for what it suggested, but for what it could no longer support. The 15-minute gap, once a wide opening for speculation, became a narrow corridor. Investigators stripped it of drama and examined it mechanically. What could physically occur in that time without attracting attention? How long would it take to stop a car, exchange words, redirect movement? How long to leave the highway and return? The answers were uncomfortably precise. There was no room for chaos, no room for prolonged struggle. Whatever happened had to be brief, controlled, decisive. That realization reframed the victim's final moments. Panic no longer fit cleanly. Neither did randomness. The absence of noise, of witnesses, of debris pointed toward compliance, at least initially. Someone had spoken. Someone had convinced. The implication was chilling not because it suggested cruelty, but because it suggested calm. Violence, if it occurred, came later, somewhere else, after the point of no return. Investigators revisited the fragment from the early interview, in a hurry, but not scared, and allowed it to reshape the narrative. Hurry implied purpose. Not fear, not hesitation, but momentum. The victim was moving towards something expected, something familiar enough to override caution. That assumption collapsed several theories instantly. A sudden abduction by a stranger no longer fit. Neither did an impulsive confrontation. What remained were interactions rooted in recognition. Recognition did not require friendship. It required plausibility. A reason to stop. A reason to listen. A reason to divert from routine without alarm. The suspect's familiarity with the area, with transitional spaces and unofficial routes, aligned too well with that requirement. So did his history of blending in, of occupying spaces without drawing focus. He did not need to be threatening. He only needed to be believable. Yet belief was not evidence, and investigators were careful not to let narrative coherence replace proof. They tested the idea from every angle, searching for contradictions. If the victim had recognized the person who stopped them, why had no one reported tension beforehand? Why no arguments, no warnings? The answer, unsettling in its simplicity, was that many dangerous encounters do not announce themselves. They wear the face of normalcy until it is too late. The service road, now central rather than peripheral, was examined again, not as a place of violence, but as a turning point. A decision point. A moment where the victim's agency narrowed. Once off the highway, options diminished rapidly. Lighting dropped. Visibility shrank. Control shifted. The road did not need to be the scene. It only needed to be the threshold. The suspect's timeline was reconstructed alongside this theory, not to place him definitively at the scene, but to see whether his movements excluded him. They did not. He could have been there. He could have been elsewhere. His alibi existed in the negative space between records, in moments that were unaccounted for but not suspicious enough to demand explanation at the time. That ambiguity, once a shield, now felt like a design feature. The case's language changed again, subtly but decisively. Investigators stopped asking who had done it and focused instead on how it could have happened without leaving a trace. The answer, increasingly, was cooperation followed by isolation. A voluntary deviation followed by a point where choice evaporated. That sequence explained the clean scene, the lack of witnesses, the delayed call to the payphone. It also explained why the case had resisted early resolution. Nothing overtly criminal had occurred where anyone could see it. The payphone call was reinterpreted through this lens. Not a cry for help, but a moment of hesitation. A realization. Perhaps the victim had been allowed the phone under the guise of reassurance, or perhaps they seized the opportunity briefly. One ring. No words. A cut connection. It was the sound of a decision interrupted, or the moment someone realized that calling would change nothing. The suspect's response to renewed scrutiny was measured, almost disciplined. He did not lash out. He did not explain. He withdrew further, reducing his world to routines and silence. To some, it looked like guilt tightening its grip. To others, it looked like survival, the behavior of a man who had learned that engagement only fed the machine that followed him. The ambiguity was complete. A quiet disagreement emerged within the investigative team. One group believed the truth was now visible in outline, waiting only for confirmation. The other believed the outline was an illusion, a pattern imposed by exhaustion and familiarity. They debated not loudly, but persistently, testing assumptions, challenging language. The tension was productive, a sign that the case was still alive, still capable of resisting easy answers. Outside the investigation rooms, the town remained unaware of the shift. No headlines announced progress. No press conferences hinted at breakthroughs. Life continued, unbothered by the slow tightening of a story beneath the surface. That disconnect felt appropriate. If resolution came, it would not arrive with spectacle. It would arrive quietly, or not at all. The family noticed the absence of noise before they noticed anything else. Fewer calls. Fewer updates. Longer silences between contacts. When they asked, investigators explained carefully that the case had entered a phase where speculation was dangerous. That precision mattered more than reassurance. The family understood, having learned long ago that words could wound as easily as they could comfort. The suspect's health declined again, subtly this time, enough to raise the unspoken question of what would happen if he died without speaking. The possibility hovered like a deadline no one had set. Investigators resisted the urge to rush. Pressure applied too quickly could collapse what little structure they had built. The case demanded patience even now, perhaps especially now. The cold case, once sprawling and chaotic, had become lean. There were fewer moving parts, fewer viable explanations. That did not make it easier. It made it heavier. Each remaining possibility carried more weight, more consequence. The absence of alternatives sharpened everything. In this compressed state, the case felt closer to resolution and further from certainty at the same time. The story had narrowed to a single corridor, but the door at the end remained closed. Whether it would ever open depended on forces beyond investigation, memory, mortality, the fragile willingness of someone to speak. Until then, the night of 1987 remained intact, its silence undisturbed, its decisions locked in place. The highway still stretched where it always had. The service roads were gone. The payphone existed only in logs and imagination. And the cold case pressed on, quieter now, denser, waiting, not for noise, but for the smallest fracture that might finally let the truth escape. When a case reaches this stage, urgency no longer comes from discovery but from subtraction. Every year removes something, a witness, a memory, a chance encounter that might have tipped the balance. Investigators felt that erosion keenly now. The margins were thinning. There would be no new evidence falling out of the sky, no dramatic confession delivered under hot lights. If the truth surfaced, it would do so reluctantly, dragged out by pressure that had been building quietly for decades. The suspect's world continued to contract. Friends drifted away, not in accusation but in discomfort, unsure how to exist alongside a story that never resolved. Invitations stopped coming. Conversations grew shallow. He became a figure defined less by who he was than by what followed him. That kind of isolation changes people. Sometimes it hardens them. Sometimes it loosens something inside. Investigators watched carefully for any sign of the latter. A subtle behavioral shift was noted during a routine observation. The suspect altered his daily route home, avoiding a particular stretch of road he had used for years. There was no obvious reason, no construction, no traffic issues. The change was minor, easily dismissed, but in a case built on small deviations, it mattered. Analysts debated whether it was coincidence or instinct, a subconscious avoidance triggered by renewed focus on the past. Again, it proved nothing. But it added texture to the portrait forming in silence. Attention returned briefly to the possibility of an intermediary, someone who might have been present without fully understanding the consequences. The theory explained how cooperation could have occurred without resistance, how isolation could have been achieved quickly. It also explained the absence of later revelations. Guilt shared, even partially, can be easier to bury when it is never spoken aloud. Investigators examined the suspect's social circle from the late 80s, mapping connections that had faded into obscurity. Most led nowhere. A few ended abruptly, lives derailed by unrelated circumstances, doors closed permanently. The family was informed, gently, that the investigation had entered what could be its final viable phase. Not final in the sense of conclusion, but final in opportunity. Resources would continue to exist, but leverage would not increase. Time, once again, was the enemy. The conversation was quiet, measured, devoid of promises. The family listened, absorbing the weight with the practiced stillness of people who had learned to survive disappointment. They asked only one question: if the truth came out tomorrow, would anyone recognize it? Investigators answered honestly. They hoped so. The payphone log was revisited one last time, not for what it contained, but for what it omitted. The absence of subsequent calls in the immediate area suggested the phone had not been used again that night, an anomaly given its location near the highway. It implied awareness, either avoidance or prevention. Someone had ensured that moment remained singular. That detail, overlooked for years, now felt deliberate. The suspect's name, both of them, appeared again in a different context, unrelated to the case, a bureaucratic document that crossed an analyst's desk by chance. The sight triggered a reaction described later as instinctive, a tightening, a sense of alignment that could not be articulated. Investigators are trained to distrust such feelings, yet they often mark the point where attention sharpens. The document itself was irrelevant. The reaction was not. A decision was made to approach the suspect one last time, not with accusation, not with demands, but with narrative. Investigators believed that if the truth existed in fragments, it might be coaxed out by presenting a version of events close enough to reality to provoke correction. They requested an interview, framed as an opportunity to address lingering questions for the sake of history, of the family, of record. The suspect declined at first, then reconsidered. Age and fatigue have a way of changing priorities. The interview room was plain, deliberately so, stripped of intimidation. The questions were calm, chronological, focused on routine rather than accusation. What did nights look like then? How did workdays end? Which roads felt familiar? The suspect answered evenly, occasionally hesitating, occasionally correcting himself. No confession emerged. No dramatic slip. But something else did, a pattern of emphasis. Certain moments expanded, others brushed past quickly. Analysts noted it later, tracing the contours of attention and avoidance. When the conversation turned to the service roads, the suspect's tone shifted almost imperceptibly. He described them as confusing, unnecessary, easily forgotten. The dismissal was too complete, too final. Investigators pressed gently, asking how he navigated construction zones at the time. He answered, then stopped, then rephrased, as if recalibrating. It was a small thing. In another case, it might have been ignored. Here, it resonated. The interview ended without resolution. The suspect left, slower than he had arrived, shoulders heavy with something unspoken. Investigators sat with the recording afterward, replaying it in silence. They did not hear guilt. They did not hear innocence. They heard control, practiced and careful, a narrative shaped by years of repetition. The truth, if present, was embedded deeply, protected by habit. News of the interview never reached the public. There would be no benefit. The case no longer needed attention. It needed convergence. Investigators began preparing for the possibility that the final answer might not be legal, but historical, a reconstruction accepted because it fit everything left behind, not because it could be proven beyond doubt. The family sensed the approaching stillness. Updates became rarer. Conversations shorter. They understood what it meant. They began to talk among themselves about remembrance rather than resolution, about how to honor a life interrupted without waiting for permission from facts that might never arrive. It was not surrender. It was adaptation. The town, largely unaware, continued its routines. New houses rose where empty land had once been. Roads widened. Names changed. Only the highway remained constant, a ribbon of asphalt carrying countless stories past the place where one had stopped abruptly. Drivers passed without knowing, without needing to know. Time moved on, indifferent. Inside the case file, the story had narrowed to its simplest form, a brief deviation, a moment of trust, a decision that could not be undone. Everything else, headlines, identities, theories, had accreted around that core. Whether the suspect had caused it, facilitated it, or merely lived in its shadow remained unresolved. But the shape of the night was clearer now than it had ever been. As the ninth phase closed, there was no sense of victory, only a quiet acknowledgement that the case had given up almost everything it was going to give. What remained was fragile, dependent on memory, mortality, and the unpredictable generosity of truth. The cold case stood at the edge of its own silence, not solved, not forgotten, waiting to see whether anything would step forward before the door finally closed. Silence has a sound when it settles into a case this old. It hums beneath everything, a low frequency that investigators learn to recognize as the approach of an ending that may never arrive. Files stop growing. Margins stop shrinking. What remains is not momentum but gravity, the weight of what is already known pulling everything inward toward a final shape. In this phase, the work becomes almost philosophical. Not what can be proven, but what can no longer be ignored. The suspect continued his life with a precision that bordered on ritual. Morning routines never varied. Evenings ended at predictable hours. It was not innocence on display, but discipline. People who carry secrets often build lives that are easy to manage, easy to explain, because unpredictability invites scrutiny. Investigators noted it, not as evidence, but as context. In a different life, such order might have been admired. Here, it read as containment. A medical incident briefly shifted priorities. Age does not ask permission. When word came that the suspect had been hospitalized, investigators moved quickly, not out of opportunism but awareness. Illness loosens filters. Pain erodes patience. Sometimes, in moments like these, people speak differently. A discreet attempt was made to request a follow-up conversation, framed as clarification, nothing more. The answer came back polite, firm, final. No further interviews. The refusal did not surprise anyone. What surprised them was the timing. It coincided almost exactly with a renewed internal review of evidence tied to the service road near the highway, a stretch of land that had resisted categorization for decades. Old maps were overlaid with new ones. Satellite imagery revealed subtle changes in terrain that aligned with witness descriptions once dismissed as unreliable. The road had been narrower then, less maintained, easier to disappear into. The night, reconstructed again, grew darker. A former dispatcher, long retired, was contacted after a notation surfaced in an archived log. She did not remember the call itself. She remembered the feeling. The voice on the line had been calm, too calm, asking procedural questions without urgency, as if rehearsing. At the time, she had thought nothing of it. Years later, the memory returned with edges. She could not identify the caller. She could not provide certainty. But she remembered thinking, even then, that something about the timing felt wrong. That memory joined a growing collection of impressions that pointed in the same direction without ever intersecting. Investigators joked darkly about building a case out of shadows. But shadows indicate something blocking the light. They kept working. The suspect's second identity, once merely a curiosity, now became a focal point again. Analysts traced the administrative pathway that allowed it to exist for so long without detection. It required foresight, planning, a willingness to sever from oneself and cultivate another patiently. That kind of transition rarely happens by accident. It usually follows a catalyst. Something that makes staying impossible, even if leaving is quiet. Financial records from the late 80s revealed a brief period of instability around the time of the disappearance. Small debts, missed payments, stressors that might have amplified a momentary decision into something irreversible. Investigators resisted the temptation to narrativize too much. Motive is seductive, but it can distract. Still, they could not ignore the convergence. Pressure, proximity, opportunity. The familiar triad tightened. The family was told, again, that there might be no arrest. This time, the conversation included the word closure, spoken carefully, almost apologetically. The family did not respond immediately. When they did, it was with a statement that surprised everyone in the room. They said they were not waiting for justice anymore. They were waiting for honesty. From anyone. Anywhere. Even anonymously. Especially anonymously. Truth, they said, does not require credit. That sentiment circulated quietly among investigators, resonating more deeply than any directive. They began preparing for an alternative outcome, one in which the case would be resolved publicly without resolution legally. A narrative assembled from verified facts, presented transparently, allowing the public to understand what likely happened without pretending certainty where none existed. It was not ideal. It was honest. Before that could happen, one last development emerged, subtle but undeniable. A letter arrived, handwritten and signed, postmarked from a neighboring county. It referenced details that had never been released publicly: the angle of the headlights, the sound of gravel under tires, the smell of oil and dust. The writer did not claim responsibility. The tone was observational, almost clinical, as if describing a scene remembered rather than committed. The letter ended with a single line: "Some nights do not end when you think they do." The handwriting was analyzed. The paper examined. No definitive match emerged. But the phrasing echoed language used by the suspect decades earlier in an unrelated context, a turn of phrase common enough to dismiss, specific enough to unsettle. Investigators debated whether to act on it, whether contacting the suspect again would produce anything other than denial. In the end, they chose restraint. The letter had already done what it was going to do. It shifted the emotional center of the case. The media never learned of the letter. They learned instead that the Cold Case Task Force was entering its final review stage. Headlines speculated. Old photographs resurfaced. The town felt a brief flicker of attention before settling back into its routines. For most, it was history. For the family, it was still present tense. Investigators gathered for what might be their last formal meeting on the case. No speeches were given. They reviewed timelines, evidence, contradictions. They acknowledged what they could not explain. They agreed on what they could. The disappearance was not voluntary. The night involved at least one other person. The service road mattered. The payphone call was not accidental. And the suspect, regardless of legal outcome, remained central. As the meeting ended, someone asked the question that had hovered unspoken for years: if the suspect were gone tomorrow, would anything change? The answer was uncomfortable. Some things would solidify. Others would dissolve. Without the possibility of confrontation, the narrative would freeze. Truth would become static, preserved but unreachable. The group sat with that reality, understanding that time was making the decision for them. Outside, the day faded into evening. The highway filled with headlights, each one briefly illuminating the stretch of road where everything had turned. No marker stood there. No sign. Just asphalt and wind. The world did not pause for memory. In the suspect's home, lights went out at the usual hour. Neighbors noticed nothing unusual. The routine held. But routines, like stories, are not evidence. They are structure. What happens within them can remain hidden indefinitely. As the 10th phase drew to a close, the case existed in a state of suspended resolution, heavier than uncertainty, lighter than truth. It had not been cracked in court. It had not been solved in confession. But it had been narrowed to a point where denial felt increasingly like maintenance rather than belief. The cold case lingered, not as a question anymore, but as an unfinished sentence, waiting for whatever final word time was willing to provide. Endings rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, disguised as routine, folded into ordinary days that look no different from the ones before. The case entered its final stretch not with a revelation, but with acceptance, the understanding that whatever remained hidden had learned how to survive exposure. The cold case was no longer fighting time. It was being absorbed by it. The suspect's health declined in increments too small for headlines, too steady to ignore. Hospital visits became more frequent. Conversations shortened. The body, unlike memory, does not negotiate. Investigators monitored from a distance, not out of hope, but duty. There is a moment in every long investigation when the truth risks dying before it can be named. That moment felt close now. No deathbed confession came. No urgent call. Just silence, uninterrupted and complete. The kind of silence that does not feel empty, but sealed. When the news finally arrived, it was delivered without ceremony. The suspect had passed in his sleep, identity intact, questions unanswered. A life ended with the same control that had defined it for decades. The effect on the case was immediate and irreversible. Legal pathways closed. Interviews became impossible. What remained were records, interpretations, probabilities. Investigators gathered again, this time without urgency, without expectation. They spoke in past tense. They acknowledged limits openly. The truth had not been spoken aloud. But it had left impressions everywhere. The final report avoided definitive language. It did not accuse. It did not absolve. It laid out the convergence of facts with precision, timelines that aligned too neatly, behaviors that defied coincidence, choices that suggested foresight rather than chance. The second identity was no longer framed as suspicious curiosity, but as context, a response to something that had gone wrong and could not be corrected. The service road was named explicitly. The payphone call was described as intentional. The night was reconstructed one last time, not dramatically, but clinically, stripped of speculation where possible, weighted carefully where certainty failed. Readers were not told what to believe. They were shown how the conclusion formed on its own. The family received the report privately before it was archived. They read it slowly, together, line by line. There were no tears at first. No visible reaction. Just breathing. When they finished, one of them said something that lingered long after